Welcome to Straight Talk Vermont with Linda Joy Sullivan, and I want everybody to know that today we are kicking off our show with two very well-respected guests. I have next to me, to my right, I have Mr. Jay Walsh, who is a resident of Newport, and I have Mr. Ben Kinsley, who is a resident of the state of Vermont. Please say you're still a resident.
Yes, I am. Yeah. I live in Burlington, to be fair.
There
but yes,
we go.
I am a resident of Vermont.
And so I'm very excited about this. We're going to be talking about a very important topic at the state level, and we're going to be talking about some local issues. So right now, I am going to turn it over to Ben first to introduce himself, and then I'll move it on to Jay to introduce himself, and then we'll get down and dirty with the straight talk. Ben?
Thank you, Linda. My name is Ben Kinsley. I'm the Executive Director of Campaign for Vermont. We're a statewide nonprofit advocacy organization that's looking to grow the middle class in Vermont, and we do that through a variety of ways. And we engage on a really wide range of topics. So everything from education, which we're going to be talking about today, to housing, to good government, all kinds of different things that we engage on. So looking forward to our conversation.
I am too. Can you just tell our listeners, please, a little bit about, I know you're published in
Yes.
a certain area in education. Could you just tell them what that last publication was? So I had posted it, but I want them to hear it from you.
Sure, yeah, we've done a lot. I do a lot of work with education in particular, and we just put out a plan last week, a proposal for how to address some of the structural issues in our education system. Really a response to Governor Scott's plan that he's been rolling out over the last 2 months. And as the legislature is grappling with a lot of those ideas on what do we do to address our education spending crisis in the state, we think we have a pretty good proposal that we put on the table.
And we'll get into it after.
Yeah.
And now, Mr. Walsh.
So, Jay Walsh, I'm a resident of Newport for the last almost 10 years, I think now. I also serve on the city's Development Review Board as well as the Planning Board. I'm not here today to speak on their behalf. They both have chairmen of those committees, and they would speak to issues of that. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about how our city charter is actually formed and how it's become law, as they are laws, as well as taxes and development and how they relate to the growth of the city and our tax base, and the taxes that are incurred by every resident that owns property here.
Excellent, and I know you have been paying attention to that for several years as far as that is concerned with the tax base, whether it be for not-for-profits, et cetera, and how our municipality works with all that, so I'm looking forward to that discussion. So Ben, I'm throwing it at you now.
Okay.
Let's talk education. You run with it, and then I'll kind of interject, and Jay, feel free to participate.
Sure.
Yeah, I think there's a real recognition. Last year we had a almost 20% projected property tax increase going into the legislative session last year. There was several things that brought that down. It was closer to the final tax rate increase ended up being closer to 14%. But that really kicked off a whole conversation about what do we need to do with education in Vermont. We have the second highest cost per student out of any state in the country. Only New York is higher, and that's largely because New York pays their teachers a lot more than Vermont does. And we also kind of in hand with that, we have more adults in our schools than any state in the country. That's teachers, administrators, all of that. So, the governor's proposal that he put on the table in January, and that he's been rolling out in piece by piece for the last 2 months, has really been focused on trying to address some of those structural challenges. We took a hard look at that. We also took a look at some of the other proposals that are, floating around in the legislature. We worked with our advisory council, which is a group of folks that is very knowledgeable. A lot of them have either spent a number of years working in education policy, like I have. I've spent almost over a decade now working in education policy in Vermont. and have served on, a lot of those folks on our advisory council have served on school boards. They have served as advisors to the Agency of Education. They worked in our higher education system. So we really embraced with that group to try to find what are the solutions going to be to these kind of big challenges that we've had. We've seen, double-digit increases in property taxes multiple times in the last decade. The rate of growth in property tax bills is growing at 2 or 3 times the rate of inflation. So there's a lot we need to do, and education is important. It's important to our economy. It's important to the future of our kids. So it's important to get it right. And one of the most concerning things to us was also, not only are we seeing this dramatic increase in costs, we're also seeing a decrease in student outcomes. So that's kind of the untold story, I think, in this whole situation.
Well, that's the correlation of the outcomes to the costs. So when we say we're seeing an alarming statistics on the outcomes, and pretty much students aren't getting where they're supposed to be, when you see it, and it's not a target, when you see it and when you've analyzed everything you're looking at with your research and your advisors, do you see it as the educators themselves are not at the level of licensure, or that they themselves are getting certificates as they go here in Vermont? Or are we equal to, say, the other states like New York, where you really need those professional licenses before you walk in and teach?
So that's a great question. I think there's a couple different answers to it. One, Vermont does have an unusually high number of teachers that are on what are called provisional licenses, meaning they haven't met all of the requirements for a full license. So and they can't find a qualified teacher. So a school will hire someone who does not have a teaching license, and they'll issue what's called a provisional license in order just to get that person in the classroom. So Vermont does have an unusually high number of those. It did spike during COVID. Like, you saw a large number of retirements during COVID. The workforce wasn't there to backfill those teachers that were retiring. But really, actually, our performance decline started earlier than that. We look at what happened, where we were in, say, 2013, 2014. We had some of the best performances and some of the best outcomes in the state. This is based on the national assessments for math and science and reading. Some of the best outcomes in the state. Vermont, for example, was ranked number 3 for 4th grade math. We look at where we're at in fourth grade math today, and we're mid-20s. So we're middle of the pack for 4th grade math, and that was just in a decade. And that decline started before COVID. So a lot of people like to blame COVID, for all of our education woes. The increase in spending and the decrease in quality of performance started before COVID. It started as far back as 2015, 2016.
So is that around the time the mergers, Act 46, et cetera, started to happen?
So there's a very interesting thing. We'll get to the spending piece of that, but you're right. There is a correlation there. But in terms of outcomes, actually, the closest thing that we can tie from a state policy perspective is proficiency-based learning curriculums. Vermont is now the only state in the country that's fully embraced that, proficiency-based, instead of a grade level. You turn in an assignment, you get a letter grade on it. It's now proficiency-based, and our whole curriculum is set up around that. Oregon, some of the Pacific states had started down that path and quickly realized that it wasn't working for them. So they've stepped back. Vermont did not step back from that policy. So we're not definitive that is one of the reasons, but that is definitely seems to influence it. So that's something that there's a correlation between the drop off in performance and that. And so that's something we need to look more closely at. Provisional teacher licenses is one of them. Also, the lack of accountability for teachers is another one. You look at neighboring states that perform better and spend less, like New Hampshire and Massachusetts, for example, Rhode Island, New Jersey, even other states that are in our region, spend less and perform better. And largely, the biggest difference we can point to is they have very strong accountability tools in their
But that
tool
would
set.
tie into where I'm going. If you have a license, there's going to be accountability. Your certificate or like learn as you go.
Yeah.
Okay, there is no accountability. You may lose your job, but there's no oversight boards. The licensing is really a
pretty
different
loose.
animal.
Yeah.
When you have a license, there's oversight there. I mean, that's always been, and this has nothing to do with education, but it's always been, while I was in the legislature, my mindset was, let's not do this mediocre Vermont. I mean, lawyers don't have to go to law school here. You could read. I mean, these are things that affect people's mentality, their health, their welfare, their financial stability. These are our children, okay, our future. And it's not going to stop at fourth grade. And if you're second, third, and fourth grade, what's happening at the high school level? And we are very Vermont-oriented to make sure that we say, trades are okay, which they are. Trade schools are fantastic, but it doesn't eliminate the dream or the desire or the need to go to college as well.
Yeah.
And so I personally question, are we preparing these students fairly for higher education if they surpass the educators?
So there's an interesting question there, which is, so Vermont does not have universal graduation standards. Every supervisory union decides what it means to graduate from their schools. And so we have 52 supervisory unions in Vermont, which we'll come back to, I think, later. And so we potentially have 52 different sets of graduation standards. So graduating in Burlington, for example, does not mean the same thing as graduating from Newport.
Correct.
Because the graduation standards are different. So one of the challenges Vermont has is we have one of the highest graduation rates in the country from high school, but one of the lowest continuing education rates, meaning kids that graduate and then continue on to something else post-secondary, whether that's a trade school, whether that's a 2-year degree, a 4-year degree, whatever it is. And so one of the things that was in our proposal we released last week is a set standard for graduation requirements across the state. So graduating, no matter where you are, means the same thing. And that way we're actually better able to track, like, what does the continuing education piece mean? And there's another piece to this too, which we'll get into, but yes, like similar standards across the state, and so that, you know, we know what it means to graduate from a Vermont high
That
school.
would be like the years and years and years in, say, New York, Massachusetts, and the other New England or other states where they had regents. You had to, students had to go in. They had regents exams. I mean, it was a universal exam. You either passed
Or you didn't.
or you didn't.
Yeah.
And you continued your education at whatever level you were at, whether it be in high school, if you couldn't get out.
Yeah.
And so, and there's always questions about standardized exams, but the regents were pretty powerful. And it pretty much not only assessed the students' performance, but it's also the teachers.
Also checking the
because
teachers, yeah.
and there's the accountability. Yes,
So if I
jump in.
could say, so I have 2 young children in high school here locally, and they started high school, or they started their school here about 10 years ago. They went to school prior in Massachusetts, which you said, you know, at different standards and levels. And quite frankly, their education in the schools that they attended there was far superior to what they hit when they arrived here. They actually, their education level declined.
Yeah.
And I have one that's doing extremely well, graduating this year, but only because of their personality that they're able to navigate the system here. But both of them lost when they entered elementary school here almost a full grade.
Yeah.
We noticed in their growth in education, and that has not increased as well. So it was a little disappointing to see that happen. And I think some of it, you know, especially on the high school level, may be attributed to what you were talking about, this graduation or this proficiency proficiency-based education. As you're talking about it, I'm starting to see
the pieces.
Some of those pieces
Yeah.
line up, and not having understood the difference between their previous education and how that was presented to them, and guiding them, and this proficiency-based concept.
But
Yeah.
that's a major issue, and I'm glad you brought that up because, students come in and they come from different areas and they are at a different level of learning, and then they come to an area or state where they're not, they're bored.
That's exactly.
And then
what
the whole
happened.
attitude changes with, well, this is easy peasy.
Yeah.
And then boredom turns into not only boredom, but it's where can I go to escape, or what else could I do?
Yeah. You're not engaging them.
Right. And when you don't have control over your need to keep learning,
Yeah.
because that's what's being ripped away, is they want to learn, but then they get bored and they are looking for something else exciting to do, and they're young and we're still looking, and
Yeah.
I'm young, you guys are over that. But what I'm saying, but what I'm saying really is, if you take away their ambition or their desire, isn't that part of the teaching as well?
So you're hitting on something else, which is interesting, which is another potentially correlating factor with the decline in outcomes, which is there was a policy shift, and it was subtle because it wasn't a state policy, it was more like local policy at the school board level over the last decade or so, where more kids who have disruptive behavior are being kept in the classrooms, right? They're not pulling kids who have, historically they would pull kids who had a mental health issue, or a learning disability, or pick one of those things, like a disruptive behavior in the classroom. Pull those kids out, and they would have like a special class for those kids that is meeting them at their level. And that they started including those kids in the classroom more and more over the last decade or so. And what they'll do is they'll throw like a paraeducator in there. So they'll keep them in the same classroom as everyone else, but they'll put a paraeducator in there. And then you end up with a situation where there's a teacher and maybe 2 or 3 paraeducators all in the same classroom, all trying to like regulate the behavior of the kids in the classroom. What ends up happening, some of the data is now suggesting, what ends up happening is that's very disruptive to the other kids in the class. Basically what's happening is you're now teaching to the lowest common denominator. So the kids that are proficient or above, like the kids that are, could be learning and challenged, are not being challenged in the same way that they could be. And that, I think, is maybe one of the largest indicators.
Go, you can.
And that's exactly what I've seen with my 2 children, or their expression to me.
Yes.
About what's happening in the classroom. Not being a part of that structure, you think that's that's how I went to school. We were all there together, but I know that what you're talking about, that they were separated when I went to school, that the disruptive students, but that's not what's taking place now.
Yeah.
And I know that some of their complaints to us as their parents was that they felt that the classroom's being disruptive. It's difficult for me to
It's
study.
difficult for me to learn. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
In an
Yeah.
environment like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I taught, because I was licensed in New York and also in Florida. I taught English, but also I taught at the university level as well in accounting area. But what I'm hearing here is that there's also going to be a resentment. I mean, the whole purpose of integrating was to let everybody have the opportunity to advance. But if you're taking away that advancement opportunity from those who are ready to move upward, or at least stay at the level that particular grade is at, they are going to become resentful of
Yes.
their fellow classmates.
Yeah.
And I cannot understand how they could keep the respect for those teachers. So I see a whole cultural change.
There is a cultural issue.
A whole
Yeah.
behavioral issue being taught based upon these inconsistencies.
Yeah.
And so what's the solution?
Well, I just want to interject one other thing, and I think what you were describing as well is that this burden is also placed on the teachers because they have to deal with that structure.
Yes.
And
it's disruptive for the teachers too.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, and the teachers that I know are they want to do what they studied and to see these children grow, and in essence, this is tying their hands a bit as other things that they're asked to do that they might approach differently with their students.
Yeah. So this is, and that's something the piece of it is the unlicensed teacher part, right, where we're not holding teachers accountable, but they're also not holding school boards and administrators accountable for policy decisions like this, where they're keeping all the students in the classroom, in most cases, regardless of how disruptive they are. And that's not a teacher decision, that's a principal and school board decision. And so I think we need to solve both of those problems, and how do you solve them concurrently is a challenge, right? And you mentioned Massachusetts, I'm glad you did. Massachusetts, if you separated it out as its own country, it would be one of the best performing school systems in the world.
We're not going to talk about separating countries right now.
No. But if you evaluate it, there's a really wide range in student outcomes and performance across the United States, right? The U.S. is ranked something like 50 in the world for the performance of our public education system. But if you looked at Massachusetts by itself, it'd be one of the best in the world, and they do it at a cost that's significantly less than Vermont now. It's about $6,000 less per student than we spend.
That's a lot.
It's a lot, and their performance is far better. So why is it far better, and why are they doing it at a lower cost? And part of the big reason is accountability. So they have both performance and financial standards that every school district in Massachusetts is expected to adhere to. And if that principal and the school board don't hit those expected benchmarks, then the Department of Education steps in and says, we're taking the keys away. Like, they will put the school district into receivership and say, no, school board.
I love receiverships.
That's maybe a hot topic up here. I'm sorry, but they'll do that, and they'll say, after the school is back at an acceptable level of performance, they'll give the keys back to the principal and the school board. But they're but they take it seriously. Vermont has never done that.
Correct.
We have the authority to do it under No Child Left Behind and ESSA.
That's right.
Both of those pieces of legislation gives the state authority to take away control of a school that's failing.
Is that state authority, or was that federally mandated?
Federally mandated, but it gives authority to the state to take away control of a school that's failing.
I see.
Vermont's never exercised that. So it, again,
You may have to look into this.
So one of the things that there's a lot of...
There is a federal board of education.
Right. No, but I'm saying...
But they mostly delegate authority to the state. Mostly the federal policy is to delegate education authority to the state. I know Secretary Saunders has been a little bit of a controversial pick, but one of the things...
I wanted to get into that next day.
But one of the things that I'm really encouraged to hear her say is that she sees to be much more interested in taking a leadership role with the agency to exercise some of that authority and hold schools accountable. And I think that's the first step. Is that level of accountability, an agency that's willing to enforce the laws that we have on the books, and hold schools accountable for their outcomes. And so that's the first piece, is that renewed focus on outcomes, whether that's, are you spending more than you should for the level of quality that you're providing? And is the level of quality you're providing meeting minimum standards? And we don't actually have really minimum standards in Vermont. We have this thing called the education quality standards, but they're actually not standards. They're process guidelines. Like how should we
There you go.
approach it? It's not an
Guidelines.
actual like, this is what we expect from a school.
That's right, because guidelines, and that's what happens a lot, I've noticed in various programs across the state of Vermont, even grants, okay, or whatever. We're going to call something accreditation when it's really not accreditation.
Yeah.
We're going to call something an agreement, even though it's not a legal agreement. They use terms a little bit too loosely here.
Yep.
And it's unfair because we need to have defined standards as opposed to, we'll call it a standard, but it's a guideline. And so
Yeah.
well, we could get out of that loophole this way.
And it's really focused on process, not key performance indicators, and that's the biggest problem
key.
with it. That's the problem with it. Like my the work I do in the private sector, like it's all about key performance indicators. You have to know what you're striving for. And today in our education system, we don't know actually what we're striving for. We're so caught up in the process of how do we run a school, we're not actually looking at where we're going, and that's a problem. It really underscored last year. Governor Scott brought this up in his State of the State address. He said we spend far too much for the type of performance that we're getting. You know, we have slipped from top in the country in a couple different categories to now middle of the pack. He said that in his State of the State address last year.
Right.
And sorry, I think you guys.
No, I was thinking. I'm sorry about your talking about the overall outcomes and actually how that affects the state as a whole. Because if we're graduating students that aren't prepared for the workforce, you know, the workforce is demanding skilled employees.
Yeah.
And to attract new business to the state, you know, large businesses look to a state and they look to the workforce in that state. And it's like, do they have the workforce that we need to do what we're doing?
Yeah.
And when that's not provided by the state educational system, they'll look elsewhere.
Yeah.
And say, we're going to put our chip manufacturing plant in New York State as opposed to Vermont. That's just a business outcome. I think what you're describing is that,
we see that
business, they're looking at performance.
Then we see that playing out with you know, the chip manufacturing that was previously IBM, right? We're seeing that play out there, where they have a chip plant in Malta, New York, and they have one in Essex, and the investments have continually gone to the New York plant, not the Vermont plant, and there's a reason for that. Billions of dollars is what we're talking, and those investments have gone there, and the technology that they're producing at the Vermont plant is now decades behind bleeding edge, and so, you know, we see the impacts of that, and it's not just the IBM situation. You know, there are other businesses that need cutting edge workforce. I think like here in Newport, Revision Military would be a good example of that.
Exactly.
In Burlington now, Beta Technologies is the one that is really pushing the edge of like, this is the workforce we need. And they often can't find it in Vermont, and they also can't bring people in that have those skill sets because of the housing issue. So like,
and the same is true for teachers too.
And the same is true for teachers.
But
we
I
can't
think
bring
what
in,
you're saying is that, and I agree with this, is that when Vermont needs to look at workforce development, it was the way I saw it over the past years. They were saying workforce development is, well, we want plumbers, or we want this. And they were seeking to fill those types of positions. They need to reassess what workforce development really is. It's not, well, we just want these types of jobs because this particular company has been here for 50 years and daddy's retiring, so therefore he wants his business to stay alive. That's not workforce development, okay? That's keeping a local business going. Entirely different animal here.
Yeah.
Workforce development is totally across the board with the whole economics of the state, and how do we get people
What is
here
the job
at what
market
level,
demanding?
and what is the job market demanding, and do we want that demand to just run on its own, or how do we assess what we actually have? So all of these questions now are saying we can't operate education in a silo.
Yeah.
And so, of course, you're not going to have housing because who are you bringing in?
Yeah, and where are you finding the housing? And so and that's a whole nother topic. That's maybe more
There's
your
another
wheelhouse.
topic. We're going to go into that
Yeah.
on another day.
Yeah.
And really, it's, like you said, it's not just a state issue, housing. It's a national issue. It's actually a worldwide issue. If you look at Canada and the UK, they're in the same boat.
Yeah, they can't
as far
build
as
housing fast enough.
If you look at the state of New Hampshire, they're looking at needing within the next 10 years 60,000, new units of housing, and that's just, it's crazy to think.
And
they can
when
build
we
that.
do the show on housing, we'll get into Act 250.
Oh, yes,
big
yes,
on that Act
yeah.
250 stuff, right? But I do want, if we just want to flip right now, just to the local issue that you wanted to talk about, Jay, and
sure.
then we can come back and jump in on this if you want, because I'm curious to hear
I
what.
do want to finish
Sure,
one
no,
thought.
please, go.
So that whole situation where Governor Scott called out the drop in performance.
Yes.
And this sort of just illustrates the lack of focus on this issue. So he called that out in a State of the State address. All of the education committees went back into their committee rooms and were talking about the and they were all shocked. They were like, "What is he talking about? Like, I don't know what is he even
shocking.
talking about?" They had no clue that we had fallen that far that quickly. They had no idea that was even a thing. And these are the people that are responsible for education policy in the state, the House and Senate education committees. They had no clue that our national test scores had dropped that much.
Yeah, so can you not forget that thought? Because I so want, when we're done with what Jay wants to, how much I care about the legislators really paying attention and understanding what they're passing out there and the details of bills. I totally want to get to that point.
So the two topics that I bring to the table today, the first being how our city charter is formed. That's the ruling document over our municipality here. And then also the relationship of property tax and development and how that affects the pocketbooks of all the residents of the city. So to speak on the charter, so the city charter, it's the highest form of municipal law because it explicitly defines the will of the voters, because it was comprised by the will of the public here, and that was by either a suggestion to the council to take up these laws, or the council organizing laws, or a committee to form a city charter and devise those laws. At that point, those are approved by the city council to be put on the ballot, warned on the ballot for the voters of the city to vote on and move it up the chain to be the chain of command for law. So once the voters vote on, they may break it down into individual laws that they want to address. Once they've approved that, that goes to the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State then reviews that to see that what's being proposed is not in conflict with state law. The Secretary of State then, passing that test, sends that on to the legislature. The legislature reviews it again, make sure, again, it doesn't conflict with their views or state law. Those charter amendments which pass the legislature then go to the governor's desk. The governor then, should he choose to, can sign those into law, and they become law of the municipality. Now, what makes these different than other laws, and they are laws of the state of Vermont, is that they only are laws governing the city that enacted them. So unlike a law that the state may mandate that affects all communities. This is one specifically devised by the local voters as to how they want their city government to operate. So they talk about how many people will be on the city council, the powers of the council and the mayor, the appointment of a city manager, and guidelines surrounding that. So that's really what it comes down to, is that they are the most profound guidance that is given to the city council to act within.
And to that point, you brought up a couple of points there, and I'm just, I want to address them from being in the legislature, so I've seen this. The legislative council in there usually just assists, or supposed to just assist the legislators with what's constitutional or not. Is the legislators' obligation to make sure the details of the bills that they want to bring forward or what they want to bring forward. What I saw happening was, oh, well, we'll give it to legislative council, they'll write a bill, and whatever they say goes, and we'll just all vote for that. And if it wasn't for lobbyists out there, you would never get into details of bills or questions.
Yes.
And I've also noticed that the administration, because what you're saying is this really does affect the municipalities, unless there's something so egregious in it, I would think the administration would tend to just let those votes happen in the legislature and not step in to say I'm against this or not against that. And this is just what I saw up there, how it worked.
I think that's a fair interpretation. I think the administration is usually not inclined to step in, especially with charter changes.
Right.
Until something gets either close to passage, like it's either in the conference committee stage,
right,
or it's actually landed on the governor's desk, and then they'll take a closer look at it. I mean, that sort of makes sense. We're only 3 months into legislative session, and there's already 500 bills that have been introduced. So like, they're not going to look at every single one of them in detail until it's
right. But I think that's something that people are not aware of what happens at that legislative level and the mentality up there, which also is going to bring us back to the discussion of legislators should know what they're talking about on the education side.
Yeah. So I guess in a level of priority, what happens is the city charter is sitting above the city council. It's law. It's the authority of the city, and it's state law. So the council can make all kinds of rules and things that affect the city, but they can't do so in conflict with the charter.
They're not supposed to do so.
Correct. And again, you can look at municipal law. You'll find all the aspects of our charter in municipal law because it is part of it. But it does apply.
I do know that charter.
It does apply only to the city because it was put on the track to become law by the city residents. I know there was something else I wanted to say about that, but drawing blanks. And it's not that they can't be changed either. That's what I want to address.
There's a process.
So there's a process. It's the same process as happened to enact the law. So these laws were enacted some years ago. If it doesn't fit, well, there's actually a lot of them that are in the charter that really should be purged.
Well, actually, as you know, I'm
because we
very familiar with the charter of Newport.
Because we don't have someone to rule over coal.
Yeah, but so what? Actually, because but that's so immaterial.
Or horses.
Yeah. However, I will tell you that charter is well written. That charter is very clear.
Yeah.
That charter, while people are trying to say, oh, it's ambiguous, it's not ambiguous. That charter is so well written, and you just need to read it and just say, I'm going to follow it.
Yeah, and that's another thing too, is that the laws of the charter are written to be easily understood and interpreted by the electorate, the voters of the city.
Not legalese.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Correct. If it was written in legalese, then you may need an interpretation of it. But it's meant to be straightforward. It's meant to confer upon the council the desires of the community. So if there's something in there that the community wishes to change, then they go through that process. They present that either by petition or by request of the council to take that up. And they again formulate it, put it on the ballot for the voters to vote on, and then it goes up the chain to the Secretary of State, legislature, the governor, and should it pass all those levels, then it changes the charter, or amends the charter, or adds something to the charter.
Correct.
Yeah. And then, so that's all I have to say about that.
Now you want to go into the taxes,
Yeah, so,
I believe.
So this has to do somewhat with the lack of growth in the city of Newport and where we are with our local taxes. So the population of Newport peaked around the 1950s. It was a little over 5,200 people at that time. And about 80% of those residents lived in the downtown area. That's something like over 4,000 people lived in the downtown area. Not all of Newport. All of Newport right now is about 4,450 residents. And most of them do not live in the downtown. About 1,300 reside downtown. That population in the downtown base is what kept a lot of the small local businesses operating. Small local businesses operating on Main Street made it a vibrant community, which attracted other people to come here to shop and to do commerce. So that foundational base of residents in the downtown area and small businesses really is the lifeblood of the city. That also spurs growth by having a vibrant city like that. So essentially, in the last 20 years, between what we've lost in housing and commercial buildings and what has been built, we're actually at a negative for growth. And how that relates to the tax base is, well, city government runs off of the monies derived from property tax. Every year we have a cost of living that affects the entire country. It's about 4% per year. So since 2020, just the past 5 years, the cost of living index for the state has grown over 21%. We have not increased our tax base by any level to keep up with that. Say just 4% a year.
So your rate needs to increase in order to keep up with that.
Correct.
So historically, what we found is like it was kicked down the can. No politician who's on the council over years wanted to have under their realm, oh, we're going to raise the tax rates. I mean, and this ties into what you brought out originally, is that we have a charter. Okay, and if you don't follow the charter, you're not going to pay attention to the economic needs of what's going on. So you had in there for years just focus internally. You had people inside who were doing operations, who were helping to decide what should happen at a legislative policy level versus just handling the inside operations. And now we're paying attention to the charter finally, and the charter really can help drive these economic needs.
Sure. Yeah, and so automatically by the cost of living, that's applied to the business of the city. So anything that they have to purchase, any services that they have to engage in has increased by that 4% a year. When you have not offset that by growth in your economy, and that is through adding businesses, real estate development, whether it be housing or commercial properties, to increase the monies derived from the tax base. That 4% just gets added on to the same resident and property owners year after year after year. And, we're not going to get into the additional 14% or double-digit taxation that lands on property owners by the state. This is within the local level to be able to handle. So I wanted to bring this up because of the recent city master plan that was just devised.
Right.
And that is calling for what has been called for the last 20 years. I mean, you can go back and look at everyone that's run for office in this town for the last 20 years, and a mandate that's been on there is housing. So it's, beyond it being a state and a national issue, it really is affecting the taxpayer here by not engaging and supporting the development of housing and new construction. It's the only way that they're going to help to alleviate the tax burden that's going to be placed on them by the cost of living. While seniors receive a cost of living increase in their Social Security, the rest of us don't. Our paycheck.
I love that you said we're not seniors.
Well, we may see a cost of living in Social Security, maybe in the future. But at least that's helped seniors keep up with the cost of living and to pay those local taxes. But we're not taking any burden off of anyone by stifling development. And we have a very, very small community. The town only compromises about 6 square miles. Our surrounding communities are 5 to 10 times the size of the landmass of Newport, and that makes it difficult for us to grow, to build new houses and such. So the master plans of building up within this city does a couple of things. It brings much needed housing, dramatically needed housing to the community, but it also brings that housing into the downtown community, which then is there to support what businesses also come into the town. Those businesses not only pay taxes, but add to the tax base. People want to live and work there. We have businesses like Built by Newport down below us here. They could use another, Dave LaForce just told me the other day, they could use another 10 employees. There's no place for them here. We have teachers at the school. We have hospital staff that we need to bring in, new doctors, new nurses. We have no housing for them. If we bring that housing in, and it takes a long time to develop this. This is why the community has to support these initiatives. The only projects that have been developed in this town in the last 15 years are several multifamily houses built by Doug Spate.
So I'm going to jump in here a second. So I know that plan. I worked on that plan inside out. And it's an opportunity plan. And right now it is before consultants who are looking at it, because the bottom line is, will there be an opportunity? Will there be the ability to actually get a TIF? Does Newport actually have the infrastructure to support all of that? And so while I agree housing is needed in all of that, I can't say that I agree isolated wise, like Built by Newport needs people, we need housing in this area. So there's a lot going on here, and every single section in that plan needs to be assessed, which does not eliminate the need for the housing, but I think you need to define where and how and what the housing is and what is the economic driver, not just the need for revenue. So I look at that plan, and that's what we explained when we actually presented it to be voted for on the council, is that these are all various opportunities or projects within a plan. Which is the one that's going to make the most sense to get specific type of financing, if in fact there could be that financing? We definitely need the housing, but I think there's a lot more drivers to what is going to determine where the housing, what type of housing is there. And I think it also ties into the education. I mean, most people came here and there was a shift because they wanted to live near the schools. So there were houses that were built to provide homes for teachers right around like the elementary school. And so there was a shift. The type of work that workforce that the hospitals have, of course we need that. But the key is, do they have the jobs? What is the pay? What are the qualifications of these people? So there's so much more going on here. So I don't want to take it that, okay, 100% this is a plan that needs to be approved. This is a plan that needs to be looked at.
Yeah, and that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that it is a plan that does focus a great deal on housing, and that's something that has been a priority for the last 20 years.
But those are buzzwords too, and that's what we have to be careful about.
But then you see the only development happening takes a very long time. It's over 10 years. The project that's happening up at St. Mary's for housing, it's been over 10 years in the works. It can't take that long. I mean, if we say that we need 30,000 more units of housing in the state within the next 5 years, even starting at today, you're not going to even have any until 5 years.
And that takes us back to the legislature with Act 250 issues and construction issues and all of that. And so I agree. This is not something that happens right there. I know we are already out of time, but I want to get back to that education. But these are important issues, and I want to have you back on here, and I think we need to go through the plan.
Yeah, and like I said, it's not just the plan. Any resident, whether they're putting in an ADU in their backyard, an accessory dwelling unit, another apartment, or expanding an apartment in their household, we've lost a lot of downtown housing to actually commercial. If you look at a lot of the houses that are downtown, you can look at what's a residential structure. Well, now it's got 2 businesses or 3 businesses in it. That displaced housing in
But
downtown.
that's the other area I want to talk about. I do want to do a next show on that, because we're going to look at operations and what's going on in the city that's creating this. Okay, and the lack of ability, and who's actually running the city here. I definitely want to do that.
That's actually a great segue. So one of the things that has been a conversation about, how do you solve the financing side of education? We talked a lot about the structural side, but how do you solve the financing side? And one of the things that there's been a real lack of in Vermont over the last couple decades is growing the pie. It's all been about, like, where is the funding coming from, not growing the pot of money, right? Which really comes back to, when we're talking about education, really comes back to property values. And most of the growth, right? So that's largely what you're talking about, right? Your grand list value, growing the pie, so that you have more to put towards municipal programs. You have more money available for the schools at the same tax rate.
Yeah, I'm sorry, just to interrupt you with regards to property values, is actually, it's a two-edged sword, because we want to see our property values increase because that's valued to us, but we also start to price out individuals. Yeah. So the average price of a home in New Hampshire right now is $515,000. Yeah. The median price of a home. It's not far off from that in the state here. I think it's around $340,000. That's untenable for most of the residents in this community. Yeah. So, growth, it can be bad, I guess, or value can be bad, because it may prohibit us from bringing in the growth that you're talking about.
Well, I think
To
it-
that, though,
residents.
too,
I think it depends on
you're
what
going
you
to
do
deal with
with
the
it.
benefit cliff issues.
Yes.
Okay,
yeah.
so you have to look at who's living where and what's going on and all these other factors that tie into that. Please promise me you're going to be on the show next week so we can get into this, because this is really good stuff.
One of the things that we've really seen at a state level is most of the growth in property values has happened in Chittenden County.
That's
It's
right.
been kind of lopsided, and largely because smaller communities have really struggled to bring in new housing or attract new industries. And we made the decision back in the late 90s in Act 60 to go to a statewide property tax system. And it has largely helped with some of those things, where like a lot of the property value growth is centered in one part of the state, and that's generating, revenues that are then distributed out to other, to parts of the state that are not seeing that growth. So there's been some success with that.
And that's a good question. So you think that was a success, or it has been a success to redistribute it? Well, the only reason I bring that up is
Let me put you on the spot.
I remember when this was first enacted, and I remember a letter from a gentleman in the Burlington area that made incredible sense to me. Now, I was an assessor as well, so
Yeah.
I understand some of these concepts. So the Burlington area, they worked diligently to build a commercial tax base to offset the cost of taxes on the residential base. When Act 60, I believe it was, when that was enacted, that took away all of that from the city.
Yep.
They were looked at as a golden goose. We're going to take this money and we're going to redistribute it throughout the state. Where I lived at the time was in southern Vermont, in the Mount Snow area. That Killington area and others were also looked at as this golden
The
goose.
ski towns.
Yeah,
There
and
you go.
and they saw a loss in their financing of their school system. Sure, the state gave them some of it back, but they also tied their hands. They couldn't even raise funds
Yeah.
to supplement their own school system. So I'm curious how that may have played out as a positive or a negative role in education.
Two things that we've seen is we have seen that spreading of the wealth, right? Where the gold towns that have a high property values, like the ski resort communities and Burlington and the surrounding area, can no longer significantly outspend everybody else in the state, right? So that is the one thing that Act 60 did well. The other thing that it did, though, which is partly why we've ended up where we are, is it severed the connection between your vote on your local school budget and the impact on your tax rate, because now your tax rate is determined by all the other spending that's happening in the state. It's not just your local spending, it's also being driven by everybody else. So if everybody else, for example, and last year is probably a good example of this, if everyone else is increasing their spending by 15%, 20%, and you're increasing your spending at 5%, you're still gonna get taxed like everybody else. Yeah. But you're not spending as much as anybody else. So there's an incentive to spend up to what everyone else is spending, and it's led to this sort of like unchecked arms race in education spending, right?
There you go.
Because you're severing the local impact. So one of the things the governor's plan does, and we support this, is the block grant, the foundation block grant formula. There's a right way to do it and there's a wrong way to do it. We think the governor mostly gets it right. And the legislature, by the way, is mostly on board with it. This is the uncontroversial part of the governor's plan, was the financing mechanism. And the reason it gets it right is because it does not shortchange any districts that are out there today. It funds 92% of current spending levels. So districts would only have to, if they maintained current spending, if everyone stayed the same as they are today, they'd only have to raise 8% in their local tax rate of total spending. The concern is that, and it's basically is like, here's a check for, based on all these factors, here's what we believe your cost per student should be. And it largely follows some of the same stuff we have in today's formula. But here's what the state is giving you for funding. You can choose to spend above that, but you're picking it up on your local tax rate. So what that does is we have districts today that are spending $6,000 a student, and we have districts that are spending $26,000 a student, right? There's a 5x difference between our
Right,
highest
there's
and
no
lowest.
blend here.
There's no blend, and so the block grant, the foundation formula model gets everyone much closer together, and then it also puts downward pressure because you can spend above that foundation amount, but you're picking it up locally. No one else is bailing you out for that spending, with some caveats, and so it really reconnects that local school vote aspect to what your tax rate is
Yeah,
going to
it's
be.
redefining the old pyramid style.
Yeah.
push down. Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's the key. So I know we do have to wrap this up again, and I love this conversation, and I want to go for another 20 hours.
You could talk about this for another 20 hours, for sure.
Yeah, I think
But what I do want to focus,
Yes, they are.
Jay, when you come back, I also want to focus on the area of, hey, the listers, the administrators, who actually has the list. How long have they not been up to date? What are they doing to make sure that we are actually assessing these things right? What internal controls are in there to make sure that it's not just, okay, this works, everybody sign off on it. So we need to look at the actual operations. These are very important topics. So I'm going to ask you if you want to just throw a last closing.
A closing statement.
Yeah.
I think, obviously a lot of people are involved in this conversation. This is a key point of frustration. Both the legislature and the governor are looking at education in general as a key aspect to, the results from the November election. I think that the key thing for us is the core of our proposal is largely the governor's financing mechanism with the foundation formula with a couple tweaks that we think make it better. And then from a governance standpoint, leave local school boards intact. There's local schools are incredibly important to most communities. School boards are the conduits to those community schools. We think it's important to keep them. Our proposal would be consolidate supervisory unions. There's much less impact on the day-to-day operations of a school from how the public interacts with them, right? You can largely consolidate those and not have impact families and students. We proposed consolidating them around our technical education centers. So we talked earlier about creating that pipeline to post-secondary education, workforce development. We think aligning the supervisory union structure around our technical education centers really helps to solidly connect that our secondary education to our post-secondary education system.
So when I beg you to come back, we think also about term limits on these boards.
That would be good too.
Okay, so we can definitely have a conversation after on that, and then I'd love to have you talk about that because
There's a lot to unpack.
here.
Yeah.
Bryce, closing statement?
So sure. I'll address specifically the need for housing. We've been calling for an increase in housing for far too long, and now it's a statewide and national epidemic that we're presented with. The residents of the community here have to get behind this development, and I'll tell you why. Every other town in the state is looking to do the same thing. Developers are going to go to whoever is the most receptive to their development. It's a difficult thing to get anything built today. And if you have opposition in a community, okay, we'll build this over here. So it will be a missed opportunity, and it will only increase individuals' tax burden. So.
Okay, and so I want to thank NEK-TV for putting this show on with us. This is fantastic. This is Straight Talk Vermont with Linda Sullivan, and I want you to know that there will be an email up there for questions, and going forward with the show, we're going to be designing it so that you can actually email questions to our guests, and hopefully eventually we're going to get some phone calls coming in during this time. And I want to thank Ben Kinsley, and I want to thank Jay Walsh, and this is Straight Talk Vermont, so send us your questions. We're hitting those topics, but we're getting down behind what's really going on because we're going to talk straight. Thank you and have a wonderful week.